Donald Trump really wanted. And later, a suspect in the murder of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson is back in New York. What's next as the charges are piling up? Bill to avert a government shutdown, but there's still a ton of questions for the Republican Party after this. Madeline Rivera investigating from the White House. Maddie?
Hi, good morning, Edward. Well, although the Senate missed the midnight deadline to fund the government, the White House says no federal agencies will be shutting down, averting a crisis. The 85-11 Senate vote to approve the spending deal early Saturday morning came after the House passed the bill earlier Friday evening, 366-34. All 34 no's came from GOP members, exposing the risks within the conference.
I voted against the spending bill because it's unpaid for, $110 billion and a whole bunch of hosts of other things that I can't support. But, you know, we thinned it down a little bit this week. That's better, slightly better process.
The bill punts the funding deadline to mid-March. It includes more than $100 billion in disaster aid and $10 billion in economic aid for farmers. It does not include an effort to address the debt limit, which President-elect Trump had called for. The White House signals it supports the bill, even if it doesn't have everything the administration wants. President Biden had been largely silent throughout the spending fight, a move the White House suggests was intentional. They argue the mess was for Republicans to fix after President-elect Trump and Elon Musk pressured the GOP to sink a bipartisan agreement. White House Press Secretary Jean-Pierre says of the final proposal, it includes disaster relief that the president requested for the communities recovering from the storm, eliminates the accelerated pathway to a tax cut for billionaires, and would ensure that the government can continue to operate at full capacity. The president is set to sign the bill today. Edward.
Hey, Maddie, apparently you couldn't avoid the windy conditions, though, there at the White House as we averted a shutdown. I don't have that problem. So sources telling Fox that President-elect Trump isn't happy with the spending package, mainly because it did not lift the debt ceiling like he wanted. So let's discuss this with Phil Wegman from Real Clear Politics and the man who sits behind me at the White House briefing room, and White House, or the Hill national politics reporter, Julia Manchester. So Phil, let's begin with you. So in this honeymoon period for President-elect Trump, it's politically dangerous to upset him at this point, right?
It is, and I keep going back to something that Donald Trump Jr. tweeted when the incoming administration tanked the first spending bill. He wrote, "We're not just the media now, we're also the government." The argument being that because Elon Musk owns X and because there's this grassroots army at the back of the president, they can kind of rewrite legislation remotely. But if that's the new governing paradigm, then I think that the Christmas chaos we just saw was a dress rehearsal for the new year. And we learned a couple things. Donald Trump is very good at breaking things. He was able to tank the first bill, but he wasn't able to build a coalition to get what he really wanted, which was that debt ceiling increase. So I know that sounds like inside baseball, but it boils down to Donald Trump is good at breaking things. It still remains to be seen if he can build things. And that's really the question going into a second term, because these bigger lifts like border security and tax cuts, those are going to be a lot more difficult than an end-of-the-year CR.
Now, I will tell you that President Biden just signed the bill, so it is now official law, and officially we will not have a government shutdown, so it is law. So, Julia, should the president-elect then even be in this conversation? Because it was President Biden that signed the bill, and he hasn't taken office yet.
Well, it's funny that you bring that up, Edward, because in the lead up to this, potential government shutdown and the, I guess the events that led to the avoiding the government shutdown, you heard, Donald Trump himself say that this would be essentially a Biden shutdown, and a lot of Republicans also said this. But at the same time, though, I think if you read the tea leaves to sort of piggyback on what Phil said, this should spell warning signs for Republicans. I mean, Republicans are touting this trifecta they have going into the new year with President Trump taking office, Republicans holding majorities in the House and the Senate. But the problem, particularly in the House, is that clearly Speaker Johnson has not unified the caucus, and Republicans are not unified, and they're also not unified when it comes to Donald Trump. And we have heard the threat of primary challenges being thrown around, particularly when it comes to these Republicans that oppose Donald Trump on raising or eliminating the debt limit. Now, these Republicans, many of them would say that they would be open to that if there were structural spending reforms, but a lot of questions as to how the president-elect or the soon-to-be be president is able to work with these Republicans who are very willing to seemingly put their own political futures on the line to get what they want.
And Julia, that goes to the razor-thin margin in the House. So, Phil, the bill itself had extra spending in it, and it also has funds the government through March 14th. So here we go again. The spending was still there. I mean, maybe it was pared down, as you heard Chabroy say, but it was still there. What does a negotiation look like now with no debt ceiling pause?
It sets up another fight, and I think that what we learned during the election is that Donald Trump didn't so much regain his control of the Republican Party as he tightened his grasp. But what we saw for these last 2 days is that his grip is not absolute. Just like Obamacare repeal in ancient history of 2017, you had conservatives like Jim Jordan and even Mike Johnson stand up to Donald Trump and the establishment and try and push him in a more conservative direction. There's a similar dynamic here where you have these 34 House Republicans who are saying we're serious about fiscal responsibility. You know, we want some cuts, and we're not afraid of these primary challenges. Now, is that going to change when Donald Trump moves from Mar-a-Lago back into the White House? Perhaps, but there's a similar dynamic here where, once again, yes, Donald Trump is in control of the Republican Party, but he seems to be in the middle of these establishment Republicans and then these conservative Republicans who are both pushing and pulling him in different directions.
But you have a new wrinkle with this. You've got Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, who are also involved in this process. So, Julia, we talked about the razor-thin majority in the House. Given that, and what's happened with the CR, can the president-elect's tax cuts, as well as the border agenda, then make it through Congress from what you've seen?
Look, it seems that Republicans, for the most part, are very much united on the issue of the border. One thing I am curious about, and we'll see what happens with those tax cuts, I thought it was interesting that Steve Bannon, an ally of the president-elect, said last week, or he floated the idea of raising taxes on corporations and wealthy individuals. I just thought that was interesting because it seems to be a break with where a lot of Republicans, fiscal conservatives are on that issue. And I think it goes to show sort of how much this idea of economic populism has really infiltrated the Republican Party and how the old guard has been, forced to confront it in many ways. Earlier this week, not to get too off track here, but I think it goes with this conversation, Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin included, no taxes on tips in that state's upcoming budget proposal. They start their legislative session, next month. So we're hearing all of these new ideas being floated, and in many ways, they could compete with, I guess, the idea or the Trump tax cuts in many ways. So the Republican Party itself is going to have to confront this because on economic populism, at least, I think that played a big role into how Donald Trump won in November.
Yeah, we're going to have to see this push and pull. Phil, in the last 30 seconds we have, what about the time frame? What if the president does not get his priorities done in the first year and it takes a little longer? Could parts of the agenda be in jeopardy?
Certainly, Donald Trump knows what's at stake here, and he also has a good idea of how much time is left on the clock. He realizes he's got one term. The big lifts are going to have to come, not in the first 2 years, not in the first year and a half, but instead, during that first year, before members of Congress start looking to their own reelection. I think he has a team that understands that, and also, he's not a political novice this time around. They expect to hit the ground running.
And we're fair here. Julia, you get 30 seconds here. What does this ordeal over the past 72 hours mean for House Speaker Mike Johnson's future?
Oh, that's a good question. Look, I think his future in many ways is up in the air. I think Speaker Johnson up until now has done his best to keep his caucus together, but there are clearly some very willing defectors. So going into the new year, big question as to whether he can hold on. We've seen Republicans go through a few speakers now. I don't think Mike Johnson is an exception to that.
Yeah, we're going to have to see what happens. Very interesting days ahead. To both of you, thank you, Phil, Julia. Appreciate it, Phil. I'll see you in the briefing room soon.
A little look at what happened last night.
In the middle of the holiday rush, what you need to
Keep
know.
everybody in our prayers. Red, yellow, brown, black, and white were all precious in Jesus' sight.
Why more Americans
Amen.
are teaching tradition and putting a cheesy twist on the holidays? We'll explain all that.
Everywhere you go.